Hello, my name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm a member of the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee, and I'd like to talk to you today about green procurement. So, in terms of green procurement, we're talking about greening the federal supply chains for the energy transition, making what the federal government does in its economic activity less impactful onto the climate. As I said, my name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm a professor of economics and international affairs at George Washington University. I'm also a non-resident fellow of economic studies at the Brookings Institution and a former member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. So, what is green procurement? It's using the government's purchasing power in a way to minimize environmental damages. In the case that we're talking about here, we're asking about how can we focus on carbon emissions, thinking about climate change as a true threat to society and to the economy more broadly, and wanting to make sure that we can use the federal government's purchasing power to reduce carbon emissions. That could mean generating fewer emissions directly. It could mean changing supply chains. It could also mean changing incentives in the market to, in all three cases, try to reduce emissions based on what the federal government is doing with its fiscal policy when it's spending money. So, why does this matter so much? Well, the US federal government is huge, and it's not just huge in scope, it's huge in its impact on the economy. It spends over $4 trillion in a year. Much of that is on salary or in transfers like Social Security, and those won't necessarily have emissions associated with them. But the government has over $600 billion in contracts that it's spending every year. Some examples: it owns or leases over 600,000 civilian vehicles and owns and leases over 10,000 buildings. And buildings and cars are things that have a lot of carbon emissions associated with them. And so the actions of the federal government can have a real impact. Additionally, by requiring information from contractors, the federal government can create information for others who are interested in reducing their own emissions. So if I'm a business owner today and I'm talking to someone who I'm purchasing things from, I might say, well, I'd like to know what the carbon emissions are associated with this product. And today they could very reasonably say, well, I don't know, and I can't give you that information. But if they're a federal contractor and the federal government is requiring that information, then other businesses would know that information is available, and it could help them change their own behavior in a greener direction. Probably more important, the government can create or stimulate markets for greener products by shifting its own demand. If the federal government goes out and says it's going to buy a lot more electric vehicles over the next few years, or if it says it's going to buy a lot more clean energy, that can help stimulate demand in those markets that firms will then start to create more products. And that can make those products available to other firms as well. There's a great example from history where the federal government decided to start using more recycled paper. And this created a market for recycled paper that then other businesses or other smaller governments were able to buy recycled paper if that was something that was a goal of theirs. And lastly, the federal government can just help set a model of best practices for others to follow. There are many states or localities and many businesses out there that really would like to reduce their carbon emissions. And through examples, the federal government can show how you can go about and do this. So, how should it proceed? Well, we at the RCRC think there are a number of things it could do. And really, it could go for quick wins, big wins, and lasting wins. So what do we mean by that? Well, you could look at agencies with more capacity to shift their procurement policy. And this could be a better organized procurement policy where it's more centralized, and so you could make changes more quickly. It could be ones that have strong analytical capacity to make sure they could operationalize any instructions that go forward. It's also, though, important to start looking for purchases with sizable emissions and shift purchases in a greener direction there. It may not be that in the next couple of years, every stapler the federal government buys needs to be a green stapler, but it is important that some of the bigger purchases in vehicles or buildings or energy or things like this, getting those right is going to be really important and could have a big impact on the emissions of the United States overall. It's also important early on to focus on what economists like to call irreversible investments, long-lived investments that you can't change later on, where purchase decisions today will generate emissions for a considerable number of years. The average truck in the postal fleet lasts over 2 decades. So if we're interested in how many emissions the US will be generating in 2040, we better think very carefully about what type of postal truck we buy today. It's also important to change the rules and the culture in procurement to make sure these policies are long lasting. And I should note here that many of the things we're talking about are things that are either being considered or actively pursued thus far by the Biden administration following the Biden administration's executive order on climate. And this last one is one example where the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council has begun a rulemaking process that could start to change these rules in a more indelible way. And it's important there to think that you should, in some sense, have two tracks. Try to change the rules permanently. That can be a long process, and that can be a process you have to take great care in, but you can also look for quicker wins along the way. What else needs to be done? Well, a big thing in terms of mechanics is just getting information, figuring out the emissions associated with different purchases, disclosure from contractors, and focusing on the different, what people refer to as different scopes of emissions. So there's the scope 1 emissions that are directly created emissions. And here you can think about actually just driving a car and that will create emissions. You can think about scope 2, where your activity is causing emissions. So if you use electricity, that's going to force someone else to create carbon emissions. And then scope 3 are emissions that are more embedded in purchases, like goods and services or travel, or just by having commuting activities from your employees, or how you use your assets in terms of their leasing and other decisions. So there are a range of ways in which any economic actor, including the federal government, can generate carbon emissions. And it's important to walk through all three different types of emissions so that the government really has a good picture of what it's doing. This, again, is something the executive order asks the federal government to do, to go ahead and figure out what is the emissions profile of the federal government. And this will be an important step to reducing emissions, is simply knowing what's going on. Another thing the government could do is use the social cost of carbon in its analysis. So the social cost of carbon is a measure that is supposed to figure out the total cost to society of an additional ton of emissions. And so that includes, if you emit some carbon today, what will that do to the climate and therefore to the economy and to people's health over the next decades and the decades after that, stretching out forever, and figuring out what does that actually cost us in present value today. Currently, the government is recalculating the social cost of carbon to be able to figure out what it really should be. And most analysts think it will come out higher than the current value that we have today. And that will make it even more important and more impactful when using it in these analyses. It's a broader way in general to think about the cost of a purchase, not just the direct monetary cost of a decision, but the broader cost to society. So you could think, for example, about the government, and once again, with its hundreds of thousands of vehicles out there, each passenger car is likely generating over $500 in cost associated with emissions every year. That's not something we're currently counting when we're thinking about the cost of a vehicle or debating between two different types of vehicles. And so it's important to bring in all of the costs that a federal government decision will make, not just the purely monetary cost. It's also important to remember following greener procurement doesn't mean ignoring your other goals. It's a matter of incorporating this one. So there are many goals in procurement. Women and minority contractors, for example, changing the way labor rules work. Those things obviously can still matter a great deal, as does the monetary cost, right? So it's not that we only focus on emissions. All of these goals are important. The point is, to the extent that green procurement has been left on the sidelines thus far, it's important to incorporate these additional costs to society that come from carbon emissions. It's also worth noting that following green procurement can in some ways enhance some of the other goals. One example is if an agency takes into account the carbon emissions associated with business travel, it may in fact look for other ways to accomplish certain goals, using Zoom, for example. In cases like that, it may be that thinking about those broader social costs from carbon will lead them to actually spend less money in certain ways. And once again, as I said earlier, it's important to change these rules formally to take into account the issues around the social cost of carbon and more broadly, the cost of carbon to our economy, and thinking about our goals to reduce carbon emissions over time. So thanks very much for your attention to this important issue. I hope this has been a helpful presentation to you.